Whenever you make choices, it's often based off of the resource scarcity. Because of scarce resources, you have to make choices. But oftentimes we find that choices are not solely determined by this resource scarcity, but also there's often non-economic considerations that come into play. These considerations might be political considerations, psychological considerations, sociological considerations, legal or also moral considerations. Example of that might be along the lines of you might be able to start up a business and make a ton of money, but you might find it not morally correct. So your choices are often influenced by these non-economic considerations as well. Now, another economic consideration that does play into making choices is the concept of specialization. You see, not everything is suited to be grown everywhere. And actually, most resources are best suited for a particular use, such as a large part of the rangeland here in Wyoming is best suited for cattle and sheep, rather than trying to plant row crops, simply because of the climate, the soil, and everything else. So oftentimes we see that some resources are better suited for a particular use. And that often aids in helping making those production decisions or making those choices. And another aspect about specialization is that we see that it often results in a higher total output. So let's dive into specialization and what exactly it is real quick. Specialization can happen across different nations, can happen across different states, or even different regions within a state. And what specialization basically means is that your particular area might be better suited for one particular crop or one particular commodity, so we're going to produce that and that only and export the excess and import other stuff that we need. So let's take 3 different states. Let's take Kansas, Idaho, and then Florida. Kansas is very efficient and very well suited for growing wheat. Kansas grows wheat very well, but Kansas does not do very well for growing oranges or potatoes. So Kansas specializes solely in wheat. They produce only wheat, and then they export wheat or they ship and trade wheat with both Idaho and Florida. And the reason that they trade wheat with Idaho and Florida is because Idaho, while they might be very good at growing potatoes, are not very good at growing wheat. And Florida, while they're good at growing oranges, they're not very good at growing wheat. So we see that Kansas focuses solely on producing wheat, and then they import potatoes and oranges from Idaho and then Florida respectively. Now we look at Idaho. Idaho is very good at growing potatoes, but not very good at wheat or oranges. So guess what? They focus solely on potatoes, ship potatoes to Kansas and then to Florida, and then they import wheat and oranges from the other 2 states. Florida, they do the same thing, only they produce oranges and then import wheat and potatoes. Why do they do that? Well, because they're very efficient and very effective at producing oranges, but not these other 2. So it's better for them to produce just oranges and ship it out rather than trying to use up land that could be better suited for oranges while trying to produce wheat or potatoes. So specialization often results in a higher total output. And let's look at an example of how that might be. So in this example, we're going to assume that there's only 2 commodities being grown. It's the 2 commodity model. And we're going to call it wheat and potatoes. And that Kansas is very good at growing wheat, but not very good at growing potatoes. And Idaho is very good at growing potatoes, but not wheat. So let's look at without trade. Let's say that Idaho and Kansas cannot trade back between each other and that Kansas must produce what they can produce to be self-sufficient. Idaho must produce what they can produce to be self-sufficient. Remember, Kansas is very efficient at producing wheat, so they're very good at producing wheat, but not potatoes. And Idaho is very good at producing potatoes, but not wheat. So without trade, we say that Kansas can produce 1,000 bushels of wheat and 100 pounds of potatoes. Idaho, on the other hand, can only produce 500 bushels of wheat and 700 pounds of potatoes. And because of their land use and the way that they have to use their land, this is what they produce and this is what they eat. Now let's imagine that they can trade, and that actually Kansas can become specialized in wheat and import potatoes, whereas Idaho can become specialized in potatoes and import wheat. So this is the amount that they originally produced and the amount that they consumed. So let's say that if Kansas didn't have to produce those 100 pounds of wheat, instead of, or 100 pounds of potatoes, they could rather instead produce 750 bushels of wheat on the same land that it took them to produce this 100 potatoes. Well, why might that be the case? Why could they produce 750 bushels off the same area that it took to produce 100 pounds of potatoes? Well, you got to remember, Kansas is not suited for growing potatoes, but it is suited for growing wheat. So it takes a lot more land to grow those potatoes than what it would in places like Idaho. So they're taking a lot of land out of wheat production to produce potatoes. So if Kansas did not produce any potatoes and solely produced wheat, they would actually wind up producing 1,750 bushels of wheat. Now, let's look at Idaho. Idaho produces 500 bushels of wheat and 700 pounds of potatoes. Well, if they didn't produce any wheat, they could increase their potato production. So under this example, they actually increase their potato production to 900 pounds of potatoes. It's because they are more specialized and that land is better suited for those potatoes out in Idaho. So let's say that these two countries are specializing in where they're better suited for, and on top of that, they trade. They trade the excess. So remember, Kansas originally only wants to consume 1,000 bushels of wheat, but now they're producing 750. Well, where does that extra, or 1,750, where does the extra 750 bushels of wheat go? They trade it and they sell it as a surplus to Idaho. So now Idaho has 750 bushels of wheat as compared to what they had before, and that was only 500. So Idaho is already doing better because now they have more wheat than they did before. And Kansas, they still are consuming the same amount of wheat. Everybody's happy. Now, let's look at Idaho. Idaho is now producing 900 pounds of potatoes. They only consume 700. So what do they do with that extra 200? They sell it to Kansas. So Kansas is now consuming 200 pounds of potatoes. And if we compare that to what they were doing before, they're not consuming more potatoes. So what we see at the end of the day is with specialization, you can better use your resources and import what you're not very good at producing, and it winds up resulting in a higher total output.